The bullet that grazed Tessa Palmer's shoulder in the spring of 1876 taught her that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. And as she pressed a cloth against the wound in the dim light of her father's cabin outside White River, Colorado, she vowed that no man would ever get close enough to hurt her again. Her father had been dead 3 months now, killed by the same men who had come back looking for the deed to their silver claim. Tessa had managed to fight them off that second time, her father's rifle steady in her hands despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had killed one of them. The others had fled, but they had left her with more than just a wounded shoulder. They had left her with the certainty that the world was cruel and that softness was a weakness she could not afford. The town of White River sat nestled in a valley where the creek ran cold and clear, surrounded by ponderosa pines, and the kind of rugged mountain beauty that made men think they could conquer anything. Tessa had grown up here, the only child of Thomas Palmer, a prospector who had spent his life chasing silver through these mountains. Her mother had died when she was 8, taken by fever one harsh winter, and after that it had been just Tessa and her father against the world. Now it was just Tessa. She had turned 21 that winter, and she ran her father's small ranch alone, refusing help from the neighbors who offered it with pitying eyes. She could not bear their pity. She could not bear the way the women in town whispered about her, about how she dressed in her father's old clothes and carried a gun on her hip like a man. She could not bear the way the men looked at her, some with desire, some with contempt, none with the respect she had earned through sweat and blood. The ranch was modest, just 20 acres with a small herd of cattle and a few horses. It was enough to survive on, barely, but Tessa was determined to make it work. She had to. The alternative was to sell and move to town, maybe take work as a seamstress or a laundress, and the thought of being trapped indoors, dependent on the charity of others, made her chest tighten with panic. So she worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, tending cattle, chopping wood. Her hands grew calloused and her back grew strong. She spoke to no one unless necessary, keeping her words brief and her expression cold. The people of White River learned quickly that Tessa Palmer was not interested in friendship or romance, or any of the gentle things that women were supposed to want. It was late May, when Kane Lawson rode into White River, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and looking for work. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of warm honey. He had the easy manner of a man comfortable in his own skin, and when he smiled, which was often, it reached all the way to those honey-colored eyes. He was 24 and had spent the last 6 years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, saving his money and learning everything he could about ranching. He had a dream of owning his own spread someday, but for now he was content to hire on wherever he could, learning the land and the work. He found employment at the Double T Ranch, a large spread owned by Marcus Taylor, about 5 miles south of Tessa's property. Kane was a good worker, reliable and steady, and Marcus was glad to have him. Within a week, Kane had proven himself capable with horses, cattle, and the hard physical labor that ranch work demanded. It was on a Sunday in early June when Kane first saw Tessa Palmer. He had ridden into town to pick up supplies, and he was walking out of the general store when he saw her across the street, loading a heavy sack of feed onto her wagon. She was wearing men's trousers and a faded blue shirt, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a braid that hung down her back. Her face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but he could see the determined set of her jaw, the rigid line of her shoulders. She struggled with the sack, and Kane's instinct was to help. He crossed the street quickly, reaching for the sack. "Let me give you a hand with that, madam." Tessa jerked back as if he had struck her, her hand dropping to the gun at her hip. Her eyes, he saw now, were a striking pale blue, cold as a mountain stream. "I do not need your help." Kane raised his hands, stepping back. "No offense meant, just trying to be neighborly." "I am not your neighbor." She lifted the sack herself, muscles straining, and heaved it into the wagon bed. Without another glance at him, she climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins, leaving Kane standing in the dusty street, puzzled and a little amused. "That is Tessa Palmer," said a voice behind him. Kane turned to see an older man, the storekeeper, standing in the doorway. "She does not take kindly to help, or to much of anything, truth be told." "Why is that?" Kane asked, genuinely curious. The storekeeper shrugged. "Her father was killed a few months back. Claim jumpers. She has been alone out there ever since, and she aims to keep it that way. Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but I suppose she has her reasons." Kane watched the dust settle where Tessa's wagon had disappeared around the corner. There was something about her that stuck with him, something beyond the obvious beauty that her rough clothes and cold manner could not quite hide. There was pain there, he thought. Deep pain, carefully guarded. Over the next few weeks, Kane found himself thinking about Tessa Palmer more often than he should. He learned more about her from the men at the Double T, pieced together the story of her father's death and her determination to keep the ranch running alone. He learned that she came into town only when necessary, that she spoke to no one, that she had turned away every offer of help or companionship with icy disdain. It was not his business, Kane told himself. He had his own work, his own dreams to pursue. But there was something about the image of her struggling alone, building walls around herself to keep the world out, that troubled him. He saw her again in late June, at the creek that marked the boundary between her property and the Double T. Kane had been checking fences when he heard the sound of hammering. He rode toward it and found Tessa, knee-deep in the cold water, trying to repair a broken section of her irrigation channel. She looked up as he approached, and he saw the flash of wariness in her eyes. "This is my land." "I know," Kane said mildly. He dismounted and stood on the bank, making no move to come closer. "I was just checking our fence line, heard the hammering and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything is fine." She turned back to her work, clearly dismissing him. Kane watched her for a moment. The wood she was using was old and rotted, unlikely to hold for more than a few days. She was hammering it into place with determination but little skill. He could see that her hands were bleeding, the hammer having caught her knuckles more than once. "That wood is not going to hold," he said gently, her shoulders stiffened. "I did not ask your opinion." "No, you did not." Kane paused, choosing his words carefully. "I am Kane Lawson. I work at the Double T. If you ever need anything, a neighbor willing to lend a hand, you can find me there." "I will not need anything." Her voice was flat, final. Kane nodded, though she was not looking at him. "All right, then. You take care, Miss Palmer." He rode away, but the image of her standing in that cold water, bleeding hands gripping that hammer, stayed with him for days. The summer heat settled over the valley, and Kane fell into the rhythm of ranch work. He was good at his job, and Marcus Taylor told him more than once that he was welcome to stay as long as he wanted. Kane appreciated that, but he could not shake the feeling that there was something he was supposed to be doing, some purpose he had not yet fulfilled. He found himself riding by Tessa's property more often than his work required, always from a distance, never intruding. He saw her working in the sun, saw the way she pushed herself past exhaustion, saw the determination in every movement. He also saw the loneliness, though he doubted she would admit to it. It was mid-July when the summer storm rolled in, violent and sudden. Kane and the other hands scrambled to get the Double T cattle to shelter, working through the driving rain and crackling lightning. By the time the storm passed, it was nearly dark, and Kane was soaked to the bone. He was riding back to the bunkhouse when he saw the smoke rising from the direction of Tessa's ranch. His heart lurched. Lightning strike, most likely, and out here that could mean disaster. Without thinking, Kane turned his horse and rode hard toward her property. As he crested the hill, he could see that it was her barn that had been struck. Flames were already consuming the old wooden structure, and in the fading light, he could see Tessa trying to lead her horses out, her face streaked with soot. Kane was off his horse before it had fully stopped. "How many horses inside?" Tessa whirled, eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment she just stared at him, and then the reality of the situation seemed to override her instinct to send him away. "3. I got 2 out, but the third is terrified. He will not come. Show me." She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then nodded and ran back toward the barn. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Kane pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and followed her inside. The horse, a young gelding, was in the back stall, eyes rolling white with terror. Kane approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, the kind of voice he had used on spooked horses 100 times before. "Easy now, boy. Easy. We are going to get you out of here." The flames were spreading fast, consuming the hay and old wood with terrifying speed. Kane could feel the heat on his skin, could hear the creak and groan of the beams overhead. He reached the stall and opened it, still speaking softly, and the horse danced back, nostrils flaring. Tessa appeared at his side, her voice joining his, speaking to the horse in that same low, soothing tone. Together, they managed to get a rope around the gelding's neck, and then Kane was leading him out, Tessa beside him, both of them running as a beam crashed down behind them in a shower of sparks. They made it out just as the roof began to collapse. The horse bolted the moment they were clear, running to join the others in the corral. Kane and Tessa stood gasping for breath, watching as the barn burned to the ground. There was nothing to be done about it now. The rain had stopped, and there was no way to fight a fire of that magnitude with just the two of them. All they could do was watch and make sure the flames did not spread to the cabin or the other outbuildings. It was past midnight when the fire finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but a smoldering skeleton of blackened beams. Kane had stayed the entire time, and Tessa had not sent him away. They had not spoken much, just stood in silence, watching the destruction. Finally, Tessa turned to him. Her face was streaked with ash and tears, though Kane suspected she did not realize she had been crying. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the horse. You are welcome." Kane met her eyes, those cold blue eyes that looked, for just this moment, vulnerable and lost. "I am glad I came by when I did." She nodded, then looked away, her walls already beginning to rebuild. "You should go. It is late. I will come back tomorrow," Kane said. "Help you clear this out, start planning a new barn." "No." The word was automatic, defensive. "I can manage on my own." "I know you can," Kane said gently. "But you do not have to." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes. The instinct to refuse, to keep everyone at a distance, battling against the reality that she could not do everything alone, no matter how much she wanted to. "I will be here around noon," Kane said before she could refuse again. "You do not have to decide anything now. Just think about it." He mounted his horse and rode away before she could argue, leaving her standing in the ruins of her barn, looking more lost than anyone he had ever seen. True to his word, Kane arrived the next day at noon, bringing tools and a determination to help whether Tessa wanted it or not. She met him at the property line, arms crossed, expression wary. "I told you I do not need help." "And I heard you," Kane said pleasantly. He dismounted and began unloading the tools. "But I am here anyway, so you can either let me help or you can stand there and glare at me while I work. Your choice." Tessa stared at him, clearly torn between anger and something else, something softer that she was trying hard to suppress. Finally, she let out a long breath. "Why are you doing this?" It was a genuine question, not hostile, and Kane considered it carefully. "Because you need help, and because it is the right thing to do, no more complicated than that. Most men want something in return." There was a weight to those words, a history of pain and betrayal that Kane could only guess at. He met her eyes steadily. "I am not most men, and I do not want anything from you except maybe the chance to be a decent neighbor." She studied him for a long moment, and Kane could see her trying to find the lie, the hidden motive. When she could not, confusion flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Fine," she said finally. "You can help clear the debris, but this does not mean anything. This does not make us friends." "Understood," Kane said, suppressing a smile. It was a start. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, hauling away charred wood and twisted metal. Kane kept up a steady stream of conversation, nothing too personal, just talk about the weather, the cattle, the land. Tessa responded in monosyllables at first, but gradually, so gradually Kane was not sure she even noticed, she began to offer more. By the time the sun was setting, they had made good progress. The debris was cleared and sorted, and Kane had sketched out a rough plan for a new barn, something smaller and more practical than the old one had been. Tessa studied the sketch, her expression thoughtful. "I cannot afford lumber for something this size." "We can use some of the salvaged wood," Kane said. "And I can talk to Marcus, see if the Double T has any extra they can spare. You would have to pay eventually, but maybe he would let you work it off." "I do not want charity." "It is not charity, it is neighbors helping neighbors." "That is how things work out here, Miss Palmer, or they should anyway." She looked up at him, and for the first time there was something in her eyes that was not quite hostility. Not warmth, not yet, but maybe the very beginning of trust. "You can call me Tessa," Kane smiled. "Tessa then." "And you can call me Kane." Over the next few weeks, Kane became a regular presence at Tessa's ranch. He came by several times a week, always with some excuse, some legitimate reason to be there. He helped her rebuild the barn, working slowly and carefully, teaching her as they went so that she could handle repairs herself in the future. He fixed her irrigation channel properly, showing her the techniques his own father had taught him. He helped her move her cattle to better grazing land, rode with her to check her fences, offered advice when she asked for it, and kept quiet when she did not. Through it all, he was patient. Patient with her silences, patient with her occasional flashes of anger when he touched on something too personal, patient with the walls she kept firmly in place between them. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. He just showed up, day after day, steady and reliable and kind. Tessa found herself slowly, reluctantly, lowering her guard. Not all the way, not even close, but enough that she began to look forward to Kane's visits. Enough that she noticed when a day went by without seeing him. Enough that she found herself smiling at his stories about the Double T, about the other ranch hands and their antics. She tried to fight it. Tried to remind herself that letting someone in was dangerous, that trust was a luxury she could not afford. But Kane was relentless in his gentleness, in his steady, patient kindness that asked nothing in return. He was unlike any man she had ever known. It was late August when Tessa finally asked him a personal question. They were sitting on her porch after a long day of work, drinking cool water from the well and watching the sun set over the mountains. Kane had been telling her about a horse he was training at the Double T, and she had listened with more interest than she wanted to admit. "Why do you not have your own ranch?" she asked suddenly. "You clearly know what you are doing. You have enough experience." Kane took a long drink of water, considering. "I am saving up for it. Want to do it right, you know. Buy good land, good stock. Build something that will last." "How long have you been saving?" "6 years, give or take. I've got a decent amount put aside now. Maybe another year or two and I will have enough to make a real start of it." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Where will you go when you have enough?" "Not sure yet." Kane looked out at the mountains, his expression thoughtful. "I like it here in Colorado. The land is good, the water is good. Might try to find something in this valley if I can." Something tightened in Tessa's chest at the thought of Kane leaving, going off to start his own ranch somewhere else. She tried to ignore the feeling, but it persisted, uncomfortable and confusing. "You would make a good rancher," she said quietly. "You have the patience for it." Kane looked at her, and there was something warm in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, Tessa felt something other than the constant vigilance and fear that had become her daily companions. She felt almost peaceful. But peace was fleeting, she reminded herself. It always was. September brought the first hints of autumn, the leaves on the aspens beginning to turn gold. The new barn was finished, smaller than the old one but sturdy and well built. Tessa had insisted on paying Kane for his work, but he had refused every time, saying that neighbors did not charge each other for help. It frustrated her. This debt she owed him that he would not let her repay. She was not used to kindness without strings attached, and part of her kept waiting for Kane to reveal his true motives, to demand something in return for all his help. But he never did. He just kept showing up, kept offering his steady presence and his patience and his kindness, and slowly, so slowly, the ice around Tessa's heart began to crack. It was a Saturday in mid-September when Kane invited her to a dance in town. The harvest was coming in, and the town held a celebration every year, with music and food and dancing that went late into the night. Tessa's first instinct was to refuse. She had not been to a social gathering since before her father's death, had avoided them deliberately. The thought of being surrounded by people, of having to make small talk and endure pitying looks, made her stomach churn. But Kane had asked so hopefully, his honey-colored eyes warm and inviting, and before she knew it, she was saying yes. She regretted it almost immediately. She had nothing to wear except her work clothes and one old dress that had belonged to her mother, faded and outdated. She had no idea how to act at a dance, how to be social and pleasant when she had spent so long keeping everyone at a distance. But she had said yes, and Tessa Palmer did not go back on her word. The night of the dance, she pulled out her mother's old dress, brushed it off and did her best to make it presentable. It was a simple blue cotton dress, high-necked and modest, and it fit her reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in places where her mother had been softer. She let her hair down from its usual braid, brushing it until it fell in waves around her shoulders. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. Kane arrived at sunset, riding up to her cabin on his best horse, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. When he saw Tessa standing on the porch, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart do something strange in her chest. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You look nice too." The ride into town was pleasant, the evening cool and clear. Kane kept the conversation light, telling her about the dance, about how the whole town would turn out and how the musicians were supposed to be especially good this year. Tessa listened, her nervousness gradually easing under the warmth of his voice. When they arrived at the town hall, the celebration was already in full swing. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the crowd. A fiddle, a guitar, and a banjo filled the air with lively music, and people were already dancing, spinning, and laughing. Tessa felt the old instinct to flee, to retreat back into her solitary safety. But Kane was beside her, steady and reassuring, and when he offered his hand, she took it. They danced, and Tessa was surprised to find that she remembered how. Her father had taught her when she was young, before her mother died, and the steps came back naturally. Kane was a good dancer, confident but not showy, leading her smoothly through the patterns. For a while, Tessa forgot about her fear and her walls and her determination to keep everyone at a distance. For a while, she was just a young woman at a dance, spinning in the arms of a man who made her feel safe. Between dances, people approached them. Some of the town women tried to engage Tessa in conversation, their expressions curious and cautiously friendly. Tessa did her best to respond politely, though it did not come naturally. Kane stayed close, filling in the awkward silences, making it easier for her. It was during a slower dance, when Kane held her closer and the music was sweet and melancholy, that Tessa felt something shift inside her. She looked up at him, at his kind face and warm eyes, and realized with a jolt of fear that she was starting to care about him. More than care. She was starting to fall for him. The realization terrified her. She had sworn never to let anyone get close, never to risk the kind of pain that came from trusting someone. But here she was, her hand in Kane's, her heart beating faster than the music warranted, feeling things she had thought she would never feel again. She pulled back slightly, and Kane noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" "I need some air," she said, her voice unsteady. He led her outside without question, into the cool night air. They walked away from the noise and light of the dance, stopping near the edge of town where they could still hear the music but were away from the crowd. "What is wrong?" Kane asked gently. Tessa wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the dark mountains. "I should not have come. This was a mistake." "Why?" "Because I cannot do this." Her voice was strained, tight with the effort of holding back emotions she did not want to feel. "I cannot let myself care about someone. It is too dangerous. People leave. They die. They hurt you, and I cannot go through that again." Kane was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, "What happened to you, Tessa? I know about your father, but there is something else, is there not?" She closed her eyes, the memories she had tried so hard to bury rising up despite her efforts to keep them down. "Before my father died, there was a man. His name was Daniel. He worked at one of the mines in the area. He courted me for nearly 6 months, and I thought he loved me. I thought we were going to get married. What happened? He wanted my father's claim. That was all he wanted. When he realized my father was not going to just hand it over, that he would have to actually marry me and wait for an inheritance, he showed his true colors. He tried to force the issue, tried to get the deed himself." She touched her shoulder unconsciously, where the bullet had grazed her. "My father ran him off, but a few weeks later he came back with his friends. That was when they killed my father." Kane's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "The same men who came after you?" "Yes." "Daniel was not with them the second time. He must have known I would shoot him on sight, but his friends came. I killed one of them and the others fled. But it does not change anything. I trusted someone and it cost me everything." "I am not Daniel," Kane said quietly. "I do not want your land or your claim. I do not want anything from you except what you are willing to give." "How can I believe that?" The question came out almost as a plea. How can I trust that you are not just patient, just biding your time until I let my guard down? Kane took a step closer, but did not touch her, respecting the space she needed. I cannot prove it to you with words, Tessa. I can only prove it with time and actions. And I am willing to wait as long as it takes for you to see that I am exactly who I say I am. I am just a man who cares about you. Nothing more, nothing less. Tears burned at the back of Tessa's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to let someone in. Then we will figure it out together, Kane said. Slowly, at your pace. I am not going anywhere, Tessa. I will be here, patient as the mountains, for as long as you need. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. Saw the sincerity and the kindness and the steady strength that had drawn her to him despite all her defenses. And she felt the ice around her heart crack just a little more. I am afraid, she whispered. I know. Kane smiled gently. But you are also brave, braver than anyone I have ever met. And when you are ready, I will be here. They stood in the cool night air, the music from the dance hall drifting over them, and Tessa felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The weeks that followed were a tentative dance of their own, a careful navigation of boundaries and trust. Kane continued to visit Tessa's ranch, but now there was something different between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither of them spoke aloud but both understood. Tessa found herself opening up in small ways. She told Kane stories about her childhood, about her mother and father, about the life they had lived in the mountains. She showed him places on her land that were special to her. The meadow where wildflowers bloomed in the spring, the ridge where you could see for miles in every direction. In return, Kane shared his own stories. He told her about growing up in Kansas, the son of a wheat farmer who had lost everything to drought and locusts. He told her about leaving home at 18, determined to make something of himself, about the years on the cattle drives and the dreams he carried of having his own land someday. They worked side by side, and slowly, the work became less about necessity and more about companionship. They rode together through the autumn landscape, checking fences and moving cattle, and Tessa found herself laughing at Kane's stories, smiling at his jokes. She found herself looking forward to his visits, found herself disappointed on the days when he could not come. She also found herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with easy grace, the way his hands were strong but gentle with the animals, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She noticed these things and felt warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that both thrilled and terrified her. It was late October when Kane finally kissed her. They had been riding back from checking her north pasture, the sun setting behind them, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. They had stopped by the creek to let the horses drink, and Kane had helped her dismount, his hands on her waist, but this time he did not let go immediately. He stood looking down at her, his honey-colored eyes searching hers, and Tessa felt her breath catch. "Tessa," he said softly, "can I kiss you?" The fact that he asked, that he gave her the choice, made her heart swell. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Kane lowered his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. She did not pull away. His lips met hers gently, tentatively, a question and a promise all at once. Tessa felt the warmth of him, the steadiness, and something inside her that had been frozen for so long finally began to thaw. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, Kane rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for a very long time." "I know," Tessa whispered. "I have wanted it too. I was just too afraid to admit it. And now I am still afraid," she said honestly. But I think maybe you are worth the risk." Kane smiled, that warm, wonderful smile that made her feel like she could do anything. "I will do everything I can to prove you right." From that moment on, things changed between them. The walls Tessa had built so carefully began to crumble, piece by piece, under the steady warmth of Kane's love. Because it was love, she realized. What she felt for him was not just affection or gratitude or companionship. It was love, deep and real and terrifying. And slowly, carefully, she began to let herself believe that he loved her too. November brought the first snow, a light dusting that turned the valley into a wonderland of white and gold. Kane spent more time at Tessa's ranch now, helping her prepare for winter, making sure she had enough wood and supplies to last through the cold months. They sat together in the evenings by her fireplace, talking about everything and nothing. Kane had never pushed her to talk about Daniel or the attack that had killed her father, but one night, Tessa found herself telling him the whole story. All the details she had kept locked inside, the fear and the anger and the guilt she carried for not being able to save her father. Kane listened without interruption, his hand holding hers, his presence steady and reassuring. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, he pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, really cried for the first time since her father's death. "It was not your fault," he said quietly, his voice firm. "None of it was your fault. You did everything you could and you survived. Your father would be proud of you." "How do you know?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Because I am proud of you," Kane said. And anyone who knew you could not help but feel the same. That night marked another turning point. Tessa felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the burden of her grief and guilt had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. She felt freer, more able to look toward the future instead of being trapped in the pain of the past. December arrived with heavier snows, and Kane began staying overnight more often, sleeping in the barn to avoid the long, cold ride back to the Double T. Tessa knew it was not entirely proper, knew that the town gossips would have plenty to say if they found out, but she did not care. She trusted Kane completely now, trusted him in a way she had never thought she would trust anyone again. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Kane arrived at her cabin with a serious expression. Tessa knew immediately that something was different, and her heart clenched with sudden fear. "What is wrong?" she asked as soon as he was inside, snow dusting his shoulders. Kane took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "Nothing is wrong, but I have something I need to talk to you about, and I want you to listen before you say anything." Tessa nodded, her mouth dry. Kane took a deep breath. "Marcus is selling part of the Double T. He is getting older and wants to downsize. He offered me first chance to buy a section of it, 500 acres on the eastern border, the land that runs along your property line." Tessa's heart began to beat faster. "That is wonderful, Kane. That is what you have been saving for." "It is," Kane agreed, "but there is something I want more than land." He set his hat down and crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "Tessa, I love you. I think I have loved you since the first moment I saw you in town, struggling with that feed sack and looking at me like I was the enemy. I love your strength and your courage and your determination. I love the way you laugh when you finally let yourself relax. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you can trust me with your heart." Tears were already streaming down Tessa's face, but these were different tears, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "I am going to buy that land," Kane continued, "but I do not want to build a ranch on it alone. I want to build it with you. I want to combine our spreads, work them together, build a life together. Tessa Palmer, will you marry me?" For a moment, Tessa could not speak. The fear tried to rise up one last time, tried to convince her that this was dangerous, that she should protect herself. but the ice walls around her heart had melted completely under the warmth of Kane's patient kindness, and all she felt was love and certainty, and a future stretching out before her full of possibility. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Kane, I will marry you." Kane let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and relief and happiness into it. "I promise you," he said when they finally broke apart, "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret this." "I know," Tessa said, and she meant it. "I trust you, completely." They were married in January of 1877 in a simple ceremony at the church in White River. The town turned out for it, curious and pleased to see Tessa Palmer finally letting someone into her life. Kane's boss, Marcus Taylor, stood as his best man, and to Tessa's surprise, several of the women from town had approached her in the weeks before the wedding, offering to help her prepare. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, had given her a beautiful dress, cream-colored wool with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "It was my daughter's," she explained. "She moved back east and has no use for it now. I would be honored if you would wear it." Tessa had accepted, touched by the kindness. It seemed that her time with Kane had softened not just her own heart, but the way the town saw her as well. The morning of the wedding, Tessa stood in front of the mirror in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, where she had stayed the night before as tradition demanded. She barely recognized herself in the beautiful dress, her hair arranged in soft curls, her face glowing with happiness. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "That young man of yours is very lucky." "I am the lucky one," Tessa said quietly, and she meant it. The ceremony was short but heartfelt. Kane stood at the altar in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Tessa as she walked down the aisle. When she reached him, he took her hand, and the trembling of his fingers told her he was just as nervous and excited as she was. The preacher spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage, but Tessa barely heard the words. All she could focus on was Kane, on the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, on the warmth of his hand holding hers. When it came time for the vows, Kane spoke as clearly and firmly, his voice filled with emotion. "I, Kane Lawson, take you, Tessa Palmer, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you all the days of my life. I promise to be patient when you need patience, strong when you need strength, and present always. I promise to build a life with you that is filled with joy and trust and endless love." Tessa spoke her own vows with tears in her eyes, promising to love and honor Kane, to trust him with her heart, to build a future together that would honor both their dreams. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kane kissed her with such tenderness and joy that Tessa felt her heart might burst. The small church erupted in applause, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Tessa felt like she truly belonged somewhere, like she was part of a community, like she was home. The celebration afterward was lively and warm. The town had put together a feast at the church hall, and there was music and dancing and more laughter than Tessa had heard in years. Kane never left her side, his hand always finding hers, his eyes always seeking her out in the crowd. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Kane and Tessa slipped away, riding back to her cabin, which was now their cabin. They had decided to live there while they built a larger house on the combined property, a house that would be truly theirs, not inherited from the past, but built for the future. That first night as husband and wife, they sat together by the fire, wrapped in blankets, talking quietly about their plans and dreams. Kane spoke of the ranch they would build, the cattle they would raise, the horses they would breed. Tessa spoke of the garden she wanted to plant, the orchard she wanted to grow, the life they would create together. Later, in the quiet darkness of the bedroom, Kane made love to his wife with a gentleness and reverence that brought fresh tears to Tessa's eyes. He worshipped her body with his hands and lips, showing her with every touch that she was cherished, that she was safe, that she was loved beyond measure. Afterward, lying in his arms, Tessa thought about how far she had come from that cold, lonely woman who had sworn never to trust again. Kane had melted the ice walls around her heart, not with grand gestures or demands, but with patient kindness, with steady presence, with a love that asked nothing but gave everything. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Kane whispered back, pulling her closer. Today, tomorrow, and always. The winter passed in a haze of happiness and hard work. Kane completed the purchase of the land from Marcus Taylor, and he and Tessa began planning their new ranch in earnest. They combined their herds, worked together to improve both properties, and spent every evening planning their future. In the spring, they broke ground on their new house, a sturdy timber structure on a rise of land that overlooked both properties. Kane did most of the heavy work, but Tessa was right beside him, learning carpentry and masonry, insisting on being an equal partner in everything. Marcus Taylor and some of the hands from the Double T came by several times to help, and to Tessa's surprise, so did some of the people from town. It seemed that her marriage to Kane had finally broken through the last of the barriers between her and the community. People saw her differently now, not as the cold, angry woman who wanted nothing to do with anyone, but as half of a partnership, as Kane's wife, as someone who had found her way back from grief and loss. The house was finished by late summer, a beautiful structure with large windows that let in plenty of light and a wide porch that looked out over the valley. Tessa planted flowers around it, bright splashes of color that made the place feel welcoming and alive. They moved in on their first anniversary, spending the night making love in their new bedroom, christening their new life together. Tessa had never been happier. The nightmares that had plagued her after her father's death had faded, replaced by dreams of the future she and Kane were building. It was in October of 1878 that Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when the town doctor confirmed it, she felt a joy so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. She had never dared to dream of having children, had thought that part of life was closed to her after Daniel's betrayal and her father's death. But here she was, carrying Kane's child, proof of the love they shared and the life they had built together. She told Kane that evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She simply took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach, looking into his eyes. Understanding dawned slowly, and then Kane's face broke into the most beautiful smile Tessa had ever seen. "A baby, we are going to have a baby." "Yes," Tessa said, laughing through her tears. "In the spring, the doctor says." Kane pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you so much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for trusting me, for marrying me, for giving me this life." "Thank you for having patience," Tessa said. "Thank you for melting the ice around my heart and showing me that love does not have to mean pain." They sat together as the sun set, talking about names and futures and all the possibilities that lay ahead. Tessa felt a contentment so deep and complete that she barely recognized herself. She was not that frightened, lonely woman anymore. She was Tessa Lawson, wife and soon-to-be mother, partner in a thriving ranch, member of a community. She was loved and she loved in return, and it was everything. The pregnancy was not easy. Tessa suffered from sickness in the early months, and the winter was harsh, keeping her indoors more than she liked. But Kane was attentive and caring, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. He took over more of the ranch work, hiring a couple of hands to help so that Tessa could rest and focus on the baby growing inside her. In April of 1879, on a clear spring morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, Tessa went into labor. Kane rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who had experience as a midwife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Kane stayed by Tessa's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, speaking words of encouragement and love even when she was too exhausted to respond. Finally, just as the sun was rising on a new day, their son was born. He came into the world crying lustily, his tiny fists waving, and when Mrs. Henderson placed him in Tessa's arms, she felt a love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. Kane looked down at his wife and child, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He is perfect. You are perfect." They named him Thomas, after Tessa's father, with Kane's last name of Lawson. Thomas Kane Lawson, a symbol of the past honored and the future embraced. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy, happy child with his mother's blue eyes and his father's easy smile. 2 years later, Tessa gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, a delicate beauty with dark curls and a stubborn streak a mile wide. The ranch prospered under Kane and Tessa's careful management. They built a reputation for quality cattle and well-trained horses, and their brand became respected throughout the territory. They hired hands to help with the work, and Tessa insisted they be treated fairly and paid well, remembering the kindness that had been shown to Kane when he first arrived. The town of White River grew and changed over the years, but Kane and Tessa remained constants, respected members of the community. Tessa, who had once wanted nothing to do with anyone, became known for her generosity, taking in a young orphan girl one winter and raising her alongside her own children, opening her home to neighbors in need, serving on the church committee. The transformation was complete. The ice walls that had once guarded her heart were gone, melted entirely by the steady warmth of Kane's love. In their place was a woman who was confident and happy, who loved deeply and was deeply loved in return. On their 10th anniversary, Kane and Tessa stood on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 9 now, teaching his little sister Rose how to rope a fence post, while 7-year-old Emma, the orphan they had adopted, cheered them on. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Kane asked, his arm around Tessa's waist. "You were so determined to do everything alone, so convinced that you did not need anyone." Tessa smiled, leaning into her husband's warmth. "I was terrified of everything. Of being hurt again, of losing someone else I loved, so I decided not to love anyone at all. And then I came along and ruined all your plans," Kane said with a grin. "You did," Tessa agreed. "You were patient and kind, and you would not give up, even when I tried my hardest to push you away. You showed me that love does not have to be painful, that trust is not a weakness, that letting someone in does not mean losing yourself." Kane turned her to face him, looking down at her with the same warm, honey-colored eyes that had first drawn her all those years ago. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment of patience, every moment of uncertainty, all of it, just to have this life with you." "I know," Tessa said softly, "and I would choose you every single time. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Kane Lawson." He kissed her then, sweet and slow, and Tessa felt the same flutter in her chest that she had felt the first time he kissed her by the creek all those years ago. Some things, she thought, never changed. Some loves only grew deeper with time. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. Tessa's ranch prospered, and eventually, as Thomas grew into a capable young man, he began to take on more responsibility, learning from both his parents. Rose, true to her stubborn nature, insisted on learning every aspect of ranch management as well, refusing to be left out simply because she was a girl. Emma, gentle and artistic, found her passion in breeding and training horses, developing a program that became known throughout the region. When Kane turned 50 and Tessa 47, they made the decision to officially hand over the daily operations of the ranch to Thomas, though they remained active and involved. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. But they were not done living yet. They took time to travel, visiting places they had always wanted to see. They went to Denver and San Francisco, marveling at how much the West had changed since they first met. But they always came back to White River, to the valley and the mountains and the ranch they had built together. On their 25th anniversary, the entire town turned out for a celebration. It seemed everyone had a story to tell about Kane and Tessa, about their kindness or their generosity, or the way they had helped a neighbor in need. Tessa, who had once been so isolated and alone, was surrounded by friends and family, by a community that loved and respected her. Late in the evening, after the festivities had died down and the guests had gone home, Kane and Tessa walked out to the meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring. It was the same meadow Tessa had shown Kane during their courtship, a place that had become special to both of them. They sat in the grass, looking up at the stars, holding hands like young sweethearts. "I have been thinking about your father lately," Kane said quietly, "wishing I could have met him, could have asked his blessing properly before we married." "He would have liked you," Tessa said with certainty. "He would have seen what I was too afraid to see at first, that you are a good man with an honest heart. He would have trusted you with me just as I do." "I hope I have honored that trust," Kane said. "You have," Tessa assured him. "Every single day in every way that matters." They sat in peaceful silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the pines. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Tessa asked. "If you had not happened to ride by that night when the barn was burning, if you had given up when I kept pushing you away." "Sometimes," Kane admitted. "But I do not think things would have turned out differently. I think we were meant to find each other one way or another. Maybe it is fate, or maybe it is just that some people are meant to be together. Either way, I am grateful for every moment." "So am I," Tessa said, squeezing his hand. "You saved me, Kane, not just that night with the barn, but every day since. You saved me from the ice and the loneliness and the fear. You showed me how to live again." "We saved each other," Kane corrected gently. "You gave me something to work for, something to dream about beyond just owning land. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. We built this life together, Tessa. Equal partners, just like we promised." As they sat there under the stars, Tessa thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the frightened, angry young woman who had sworn never to trust again, to the contented wife and mother and grandmother she was now. It had taken courage to let go of the ice walls around her heart. It had taken even more courage to trust Kane with the tender, wounded parts of herself. But it had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every moment of vulnerability, all of it had been worth it for this life they had built together. More years passed, bringing more grandchildren, more joy, more of the simple happiness that came from a life well lived and love well shared. Kane and Tessa grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies slowing, but their love never diminishing. They spent their later years sitting on the porch they had built together, watching the sun set over the ranch that bore both their names, telling stories to their grandchildren about the old days, about how the West had been when they were young. And every time they told the story of how they met, the grandchildren would lean in close, fascinated by the tale of the lonely woman with ice around her heart and the patient cowboy who had melted those walls with kindness. On a warm summer evening in 1905, when Kane was 71 and Tessa 68, they sat together on that familiar porch, their hands intertwined as they had been for nearly 30 years of marriage. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear their grandchildren laughing. "It has been a good life," Kane said softly. "The best life," Tessa agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "I love you, Tessa Lawson," Kane said, just as he had said every day for the past 3 decades. "Today, tomorrow, and always." "And I love you," Tessa replied, her heart full to bursting with the truth of it. "Forever and always, my patient cowboy. Thank you for never giving up on me." They sat together as the sun slipped below the horizon, two souls who had found each other in the wild and beautiful West, who had built a life of love and trust on the foundation of his patience and her courage. The ice walls that had once guarded Tessa's heart were long gone, melted away by the steady, persistent warmth of Kane's love, replaced by a heart that was open and full and overflowing with joy. It was, Tessa thought as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the happiest of endings. And the very best of beginnings, all those years ago when a stubborn, frightened woman met a patient, kind cowboy, and slowly, carefully, learned to trust and love again. The ranch they built together, the family they raised, the love they shared, all of it was a testament to the power of patience and kindness, to the healing that comes from letting someone in, to the beauty that emerges when ice finally melts into warmth. Their story became legend in White River, passed down through generations. The tale of Tessa Palmer, who had guarded her heart behind icy walls, and Kane Lawson, the cowboy who had melted them with patient kindness, became a reminder that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that trust can be rebuilt, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is open their heart and let themselves be loved. And in the little cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, when their time finally came years later within months of each other, they were buried side by side under a single headstone that read simply, "Kane and Tessa Lawson, partners in life, partners in love, together forever." Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to work the ranch for generations, each one carrying forward the legacy of love and trust and partnership that Kane and Tessa had established. The land prospered, the family grew, and the story lived on. But the true legacy was not the land or the cattle, or even the family name. The true legacy was the lesson that Kane and Tessa had lived every day of their lives together. That patience can overcome fear, that kindness can melt even the coldest heart, and that love, real and true and lasting love, is always worth the risk of opening your heart and letting someone in. In the end, that was the story of Tessa and Kane. A story of ice melted by warmth, of fear overcome by trust, of two people who found each other in the wild and beautiful West and built a love that lasted not just a lifetime, but forever.